morning, everyone, and thanks for joining me with today. As part of the On Tracks webcast series, I will be presenting on a new application included with the latest release of 7.6 Oil and Gas, or the HSE Manager Solution add-on, by the Bypass Management application. In terms of for today's agenda, what we're going to cover here is we'll talk a little bit about what bypass management is and how it's intended to be used in Maximo. We'll look at how Maximo provides the framework for managing different types of bypass processes. We'll touch on some of the core functionality that can be enhanced by using this new application. And then we'll even take a look at some of the benefits that your organization may obtain by using this new application. From there, I'll provide you with a few different use case scenarios that may relate to your organization. And then I have a sample bypass management process that we can walk through just before we get into a Maximo demonstration where we'll walk through one of the use case scenarios. And then just as Brian mentioned, at the end, we'll wrap up with any questions that you might have during the presentation. Okay, so let's begin here. So what is bypass management? So as I did mention, it is one of the new applications that's included in the latest release of Oil and Gas, or the Health, Safety, and Environmental Manager Solution add-ons. The application's been designed to manage operations that deviate from your standard operating practices. These can also sometimes be referred to as inhibits or overrides. They're typically related to safety-related items or systems such as fire or gas detection, security systems, mechanical systems, emergency shutdown systems, or even an alarm system. Bypassing your standard operations typically must comply with regulatory requirements, which will then could be required during shutdowns and other process transitions. Sometimes this can be the most dangerous periods within operations. These scenarios are typically infrequent. They'll occur over a short period of time, and they might not qualify or align with your existing management of change processes. But they do still require some clear documentation and supervision as they're managed under specific conditions. When you bypass your standard operating procedures, the timing and the process steps and the actual change are very critical, and they might require their own safety system and process to be put in place. The bypass management application in Maximo supports integrity management by integrating with your existing work management processes and aligning that with your current bypass process. By incorporating this in Maximo, it'll help you to manage the cycle of work for those bypasses, as well as a place to identify hazards that might be associated with that bypass, actions that could be required during, prior, or after the bypass has been implemented, as well as give you a platform to document formal review and approval processes. The application itself will help you to assess the impact of the overall bypass and analyze potential risks involved to ensure both the safe execution and closeout of that process. As previously mentioned, the new application integrates with core functionality within Maximo. Some of the applications that it integrates nicely with include service requests, work order tracking, standard actions, and action tracking, just to name a few. You can create a bypass management record from any of these applications. As well, you can create a record in one of these applications directly from the bypass management application. And then the records will then be referenced under the Related Records tab. You've probably seen this in some of our other applications. You've also got the ability to leverage classifications to further define additional bypass questions or parameters, such as defining risk levels or certain testing that might be required during the bypass process. Each of these can be identified as individual attributes and then mapped to the bypass process itself. The application also integrates with various oil and gas or HSE manager applications such as operator logs, incidents, management of change, risk assessments, improvements, and investigations. An example may be during routine operations, an operator may create an operator log to record what occurred during shift. And during that time, they might have identified that there's a need to bypass standard operations, and that would be then documented in that operator log. From there, we could create a new bypass management record to document what's required to bypass those standard operations, and then that related record relationship has then been built. As part of the bypass management process, you can also define a formal review and approval process, and then have the ability to enforce that process by ensuring that the reviews and approvals are completed by somebody who is deemed to be qualified or authorized to do so. The application will also use similar record statuses to what you've seen in work order tracking. So out of the box, these will include waiting approval, approved, in progress, active, removed, completed, closed, canceled, waiting material, and waiting scheduling. Just as you can in other applications, we can configure the statuses that are available to align with your existing processes today. You can also define what statuses, other than waiting approval, in which that record can further be edited in. And last but not least, you can leverage Maximo's workflow capabilities to control the life cycle of the bypass record by routing it to the appropriate individuals that have been identified for the review and approval process, again, based on your defined business processes. Some of the benefits to implementing the bypass management application include increased control of your existing process. So by leveraging Maximo's workflow capabilities, you can ensure that the workflow aligns with your process and that any required reviews and approvals are completed by the appropriate people in the order that it was designed to take place. You can also include things like escalations as part of this to enforce that the reviews or any actions required are completed in a timely manner, as well as use Maximo's communication functionality through emails or work log records or even system notifications throughout that record's life cycle. Another benefit is to increase efficiencies by utilizing your existing work management processes and tools. This includes allocating resources during bypass operations, utilizing bypass record templates. You can create those and apply them when necessary, and also apply existing service level agreements, risk assessment records, and standard actions. And last but not least, you can also improve your analytics, your auditing, and reporting by linking related records such as work orders, MOCs, incident records, or even operator logs. Okay, I've outlined some potential use case scenarios that might be relevant to your organization. The first one I've got here are fire detection systems, so you might need to temporarily disable a fire detection system during routine maintenance. You may require the ability to deactivate a measurement alarm on your tank to perform some preventative maintenance. As part of routine pigging, you may be required to disable any instrumentation tools that measure pressure or density while pigging activities take place. You may need to bypass unstable operating conditions associated to a refrigeration system while repairs are being completed. Or you may have a scenario where a pipe connection around a valve or another installed control mechanism that allows the passage of fluid through a pipeline needs to be rerouted for any adjustments or repairs. Okay, so now here I've got a sample bypass management business process that could be defined in Maximo. This sample process has been broken out into 4 different phases. So the first phase, which is represented by the purple boxes, this is the request phase. So this is where we are identifying the need for the bypass, documenting the high-level details of what's required, and initiating that verification of that request. The next phase, which is represented by those blue boxes, this is where the review and approval takes place. This is where we will include a hazard review, a bypass checklist, which may include activities or notifications that need to be done prior, during, and after that bypass has been executed. We might determine the level of approvers and reviewers based on the risk associated to that bypass The higher risk may require a higher level of approval authority, whereas a lower risk may require a smaller group of review and approvers. The next phase, which is represented by the green boxes here, is the actual implementation phase. So this is where the bypass is implemented. The standard operating procedures are temporarily rerouted while that work is completed, and then we'll have we'll be continuously monitoring that bypass to ensure that it is still required. And finally, the last phase where you see the yellow boxes, this is where that bypass will be removed and the process is then formally completed and closed out. So if you consider the use cases that were listed on the previous slide, we can walk through this process here. So we might have a need to bypass standard operations that could be identified by a planner. At this point here, it could then be validated by an operations supervisor. During this checkpoint, that ops supervisor may have the need to create an MOC if that bypass is not considered to be a short-term procedure. We may decide that it better aligns with the management of change, and then from that bypass record, create an MOC and continue the process with that MOC record. Alternatively, we can continue with the bypass, and then as I mentioned, conduct a hazard review to identify all potential hazards that might arise prior, during, and after that bypass has been executed. We can also develop and document a checklist that's unique to each type of bypass. This, again, will be to ensure that all required actions and tasks that are necessary are identified and outlined on that record. At this point, you can also assign individual actions to people and have those individuals complete their action within Maximo. Your organization may require that any bypass requests over a certain risk level require approval from specific roles, such as an operations manager or a facilities manager prior to implementation. And maybe those bypass requests that have a lower risk can be reviewed and approved by other individuals. Once that request has been reviewed and approved, the bypass can then be implemented, so again, down to the green boxes. At this time, a maintenance manager may be required to continuously monitor the bypass and confirm that it is still valid and required. Once it is no longer needed and we can return back to standard operations, the removal of that bypass is then requested and could be reviewed by the operations manager. In the event that the bypass should remain in place, an MOC record could be created to capture that change, and then the details on the bypass record could then be updated to note that an MOC record has been initiated. Otherwise, if it's approved to be removed, then that operator can return that piece of equipment back to standard operating conditions, complete that bypass record, and then we have the ability to review the contents as a whole and close that record out. At that time, once the record's been closed out, then it will become a historical read-only record. Okay, so now let's quickly pop over to Maximo and we will walk through that demonstration here. So first thing, I'm going to log into Maximo and we will pick up a record that has been created. The first thing that I would like to note here is the version of Maximo that I am using here includes a variety of solution add-ons. So in here we've got Maximo Oil and Gas 7601, Scheduler 7640, Maximo for Utilities 76, Asset Management Work Center 7601, and then last but not least, Maximo for Transportation 7621. Therefore, you might see some applications or fields or additional functionality that are included in some of these other industry solutions. Okay, So here we start here on our Start Center, and as with other applications and processes in Maximo, we can configure an existing Start Center or create a new Start Center portlet for your bypass management records. Otherwise, we can navigate to the bypass management application. It is part of the operations oil module and listed here under bypass management. Okay. So from the list view, we can create a new bypass record from the icon on the Maximo toolbar or from the sidebar navigation under the Common Actions section here. But for the purpose of today's demo, I do have a record started that we will walk through, and we'll review the different pages of that record here. So starting on the top, the main bypass tab here, this is where we're going to capture the main details of the bypass procedure. So there are plenty of fields available to capture the information based on your existing process. As with other applications in Maximo, you can remove, configure, modify, and add fields to each of these pages or tabs to suit your business. From this tab, as you've seen in other applications, we've got our header information up at the top that will be continued to be displayed on each of the different tabs or pages within this record. Here's where we can provide a short description of the required bypass. We can identify the type of bypass or even categorize the bypass as well. In the bypass details section, this is where we can identify the location or the piece of equipment that may be impacted, as well as provide both a reason for the bypass and the further scope of the bypass that's going to be required here. In this example, I've created a bypass record to disarm the fire detection system while we perform some welding activities. And then once those welding activities have been completed, we'll enable the fire detection system and essentially return everything back to operating procedures. So I have some of that information already captured here. There's some additional details that you can also record that include what type of monitoring mechanism you're going to use during that bypass, any safety critical elements that may be associated, what type of technical authority is involved. You can also flag that this record might be considered a long-term bypass operation. You could identify the review frequency that must be required during the bypass. And then last but not least, in our date section here, you can update your target start and finish dates, as well as actual start and finish dates, and then provide an estimation of how long the work is going to be, or that bypass is going to be required to complete the work. Okay. So next we have our hazard review tab. So all the details from our header have carried over. Here we've got the ability to identify a risk assessment value here. You can utilize this field if you're already using the risk assessment application in Maximo. If you do use that application, the risk ranking associated on that risk assessment record will carry over and populate in the risk ranking field here. Some of the clients we work with today, they do prefer to complete their risk assessment activities outside of Maximo and instead will attach some sort of supporting documentation to reference that information, which again you will be able to view from that attachments link here. So I've attached a sample risk assessment document that can be referenced on this record. In the review action section, this is where you can identify specific hazard-associated actions. That these are defined in our standard actions application, and they're applicable specifically to the hazard review of the proposed bypass. So in this example, we've got a hazard assessment identified. I can expand this line and show you here. There's a little bit more information listed here. We can action or assign that action to an individual person. We can categorize the action. Some of the new functionality with the standard actions application in 7.6 is we have the ability to flag that these actions are now repeatable and can be used multiple times on the same record. We can confirm if an action is required to be reviewed by someone else. If we're requiring the person that the action's been assigned to record some sort of response. And then we can even further define the details associated to that action. So in here, we've got some items that need to be considered as part of that overall action. Okay. Next, we've got our checklist tab. So on the checklist tab, it allows you to identify all the actions that are required before, during, and after that bypass has been implemented. Essentially, this is going to become your checklist of everything that needs to be done while you execute that bypass of your standard operating procedures. You can assign each of these actions to a single person or to a group of people. You can enforce that the completion of those actions are signed off. And then again, as in the previous example here I had mentioned, you also still have the ability to flag if that action is repeatable. Next up, we have our Review and Approve tab. So here is where you can identify who should be involved in both the review process and the final approval process. The Review and Approve tab here in the Bypass Management application functions just like the Review and Approve tab in the MOC application. So for those of you who are familiar with the MOC application, out of the box, those individuals that are listed in the Reviewers table cannot also be listed in the Approver table, or vice versa. Maximo views the roles or the responsibilities in each of these tables to be essentially similar actions or duplicate work, and therefore the system prevents you from assigning that duplicate effort to the same individual. So what some of our clients will choose to do, especially in the MOC side, is if someone needs to be part of both the review and approval piece, they will just be listed in that approval table, and they'll still be able to participate and see what's been completed or any comments that have been associated after that review process. Okay. And then as I previously mentioned, if you do choose to leverage the workflow functionality, you can develop something that will then just enforce your business rules during this phase. So for example, you may require that the approval phase occurs only after everyone listed in the review table has completed their review of this bypass record. We've also got a specifications page available to us. Just as you've seen in other applications within Maximo, you can leverage the specifications tab just to further define or categorize your records. So here we could define additional questions or parameters to help classify our bypass records and apply specific attributes. So for example, you may not choose to use risk assessments within Maximo, but you still want to be able to identify risk levels. So you could choose to do that here in the specifications and apply attributes that are associated to risks and rank the activities or the hazards within the bypass right here on the specifications tab. Next, we've got our Related Records tab. This displays a list of all records that have been related to this particular bypass record. So this could include related work orders, MOCs. In our tickets section, this could be service requests or incident records. And then we've got a new table here where you can also relate operator log entries. The relationship of the records function the same as in other applications. So you could see a originating record, a follow-up record, or a related record. Then we've got our log tab. So both the work log and the communication log tabs are available here. This is where you can capture feedback, concerns, and comments regarding the bypass activities under the Work Log subtab. And then any emails that are sent through Maximo, so either manually, you've sent an email to perhaps everyone listed in the Approver tab, information about this bypass record, or if the system sends email notifications on your behalf, those will all be tracked under the Communication Log subtab. And last but not least, we have our Closure tab. It's here where you can record the details to support the removal and the closure of the bypass operations. Your organization may be required to have your closure activities reviewed and signed off by someone, or alternatively, the process in itself might be audited in the future, so you can flag your records to be audited in the future at the very bottom in the review details section. Okay, so that's an overview of the different pages within the record. So now what we'll do is we'll complete, to wrap up the demo here, what we'll do is we'll complete this bypass record. What I have done is I've had a user, Julie Daniels, has created a bypass record to disable the fire alarms. This was triggered by a work order record, and we require some welding activities as part of that work order. So the bypass record's been created to deviate from our standard operating procedures so we can complete the welding activities and then get ourselves back up and running to those standard procedures. So on the main tab, I have categorized the bypass as a procedure, and our type of bypass is alarm, because we're going to bypass our alarm systems. I've identified the location and the piece of equipment in which this is impacted and provided both a reason and scope information about this record. I've also noted here that we're going to have a manual check and monitor every 1 hour to ensure that no emergencies arise while that work is being done. Okay. If I move over to my hazard review tab here, Julie has associated a risk assessment record, which brought over the risk ranking. And in the review actions, she's identified that a hazard assessment is required, and she did assign that to Abby. So Abby has completed that that hazard assessment and done her electronic sign-off. And also she's flagged each of the review items that have also been associated as part of that overall hazard assessment here. From the checklist, as you saw when we reviewed this page, Julie's outlined the actions that are required as part of this bypass procedure, as well as identified who's responsible for completing each of these actions. So there are some where she's signed off on herself. So for example, ensuring that the appropriate individuals have been identified on the record or the right notifications have been sent out. We do have 2 actions that are outstanding here where we're going to actually disable the fire alarm and then enable it again. So as part of this demo, we'll sign off on those actions. And then on that review and approve tab, we've got our review list as well as our approvers. So our review process has already taken place. And in terms of approvals, we've got 1 outstanding approval to take place. So right now I am logged in as Mike Wilson. I do have an action to review this record and sign off that I am approving it. So I can expand this here to show you we've got a comment section so that we can record any feedback here, or alternatively we can do that in the work log tab. After we have reviewed all of the details and we're ready to approve the record, I can check the box. Maximo will then provide a date and time stamp for me to show that on this date and time I did approve this record. And now what I can do is I can update the status of this record from waiting approval to approved by using the change status icon and updating my status to approved. And here you can see a list of available statuses that are out of the box. Again, these can all be configured to align with your process. And on that note, if you do have a process that you would prefer to use workflow, then rather than selecting the change status icon, we would use the route workflow icon that's located up at the top on the Maximo toolbar. So I'll update the status to approved and hit OK. And then you'll notice here that the system will update the status of my record from waiting approved to approved. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to log back in as Julie Daniels. So Julie has been notified here that this record is now been approved, and we're going to go into our implementation phase and actually implement this bypass procedure. So what Julie's going to do is from the checklist tab here, she's going to update the disable fire alarm tab and confirm that we've now disabled our fire alarms. So I have here that Chris Winters is the person that's actioning this task. So Chris has actually disabled the alarm, and Julie's going to sign off here that this action is complete. And now we can push this record into an in-progress status. This is to indicate that our bypass is now in progress, and the record is then updated in the status field here. So once those welding activities have then been completed, Julie would then go and update that enabled fire alarm action to confirm that the activities for the welding activities are completed, and we have now reverted back to our standard operating procedures. In the event that Julie has received any supporting documentation from the operator, she can also attach that to the record through the attachments functionality just by adding a new file. And attaching that here to her record. So now we've got our new documentation listed here. And once Julie has attached all of her documentation and has confirmed that this record has been completed, she can then change the status of her record to flag that it's been completed. So then Maximo will update the status here. Your organization may also require that someone other than the person who's created the bypass record must review it prior to closure. So in that case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to log out as Julie and log back in as Wilson. And Wilson may be required to confirm all of the details associated with that bypass management record are complete and the right documentation has been attached. From that closure tab here, Wilson will also have the ability to record some closure details that have been associated. So this is where we might want to document any lessons learned during the bypass procedure itself, what went well, where is there room for opportunity and improvement, any information that might be required by your organization as part of the bypass management review process can be recorded in here. And then finally, once Wilson has determined that all of the details have been documented, we can then sign off here in the closure review. And once I've entered my name in, the system will provide a date and time stamp. And at this time, I can also flag if this record is going to be required to have an audit completed on it in the future, just by checking the box. The audit field below here is to associate a record from the audits and survey application that's in Maximo, so you can also use that additional application to link your records in the system. Once Wilson has signed off on that closure, the last step is to change the status, mark this as a closed record, and then Maximo will update this status to close, and every field within the record will become read-only, and this will become a historical record that you can still continue to report on in the future.